Close your eyes and try to remember the first time a piece of software actually made you feel physically unsafe. For me, it was 1996. I was 6 years old, sitting cross-legged on a patterned carpet. The grey controller cable stretched so tight across the room it was humming like a tripwire. My heart wasn't just beating, it was thumping against me ribs, keeping time with the rhythmic thud of a pixelated zombie dragging its foot across a pre-rendered hallway. Back then, my imagination filled in all the gaps the 32-bit hardware couldn't reach. I didn't see polygons, I saw a nightmare. Fast forward only 6 years later to 2002, I'm standing in a shop, staring at the back of a Nintendo GameCube box, and I realised that Capcom didn't just remake a game, they somehow reached into my 6-year-old brain and pulled out the exact version of the Spencer Mansion I had imagined. The leap was staggering. We're talking about a 6-year gap between the original and the remake, the same amount of time that separates Resident Evil 3 Remake from Resident Evil Requiem today. Flippin' heck, I'm getting old, but in that tiny window of time, the franchise evolved from B-movie charm to unrivaled masterpiece. While Resident Evil 2 will always be my favourite game of all time for its chaotic cinematic downfall of a city, the Resident Evil Remake, without a shadow of a doubt, is the greatest survival horror game ever made. It is the gold standard. It is the reason I begged my mum for a GameCube just 2 years after I'd done the same for a Dreamcast. It is a game so perfect that even now, in an era of photorealistic RE engine overhauls, the 2002 remake stands untouchable. This isn't just a polish job, it's an atmospheric suffocating of the senses.
Is everyone all right?
Barry. Where's Barry?
What is this place?
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.
If you were a PlayStation kid in the late 90s, the announcement of the Capcom 5 felt like a genuine betrayal. We had grown up with Resident Evil as the crown jewel of the Sony library. It was the series that gave the PS1 its cool, adult edge. So when Shinji Mikami stood up and announced that the future of the franchise was moving exclusively to the Nintendo GameCube, it sent shockwaves through the industry. This wasn't just a business deal, it was a philosophical shift. Mikami had become disillusioned with the original 1996 game, famously stating that it hadn't aged well and didn't represent his true vision for survival horror. He felt the PlayStation 2 hardware was struggling to deliver the specific, atmospheric fidelity he craved, and he saw the GameCube as the high-powered lunchbox that could finally make the Spencer Mansion feel real. The stakes were impossibly high. Moving away from a massive install base like the PS2 to a Nintendo console, which at the time still struggled with a family-friendly reputation, was a massive gamble. But the moment the first screenshots hit the magazines, the complaining stopped. We saw Jill Valentine standing in a dining room where the grandfather clock actually ticked and the fireplace cast flickering, real-time shadows across the floorboards. It made the PS1 original look like a rough draft. This was the game that made me look at my Dreamcast, the console I'd begged for just 2 years prior for Code Veronica, and realise that I was going to have to find a way to get a GameCube. It was a bold, aggressive move that ultimately led to a commercial failure upon its initial release, simply because the GameCube didn't have the numbers to support it. But in terms of creative legacy, it was the smartest thing Capcom ever did. They stopped chasing the limitations of the hardware and started chasing the limitations of our own fear. They weren't just making a remake, they were creating a masterpiece that would outlive the console it was born on. It was a declaration that Resident Evil wasn't just a PlayStation game, it was a genre-defying force that could command your loyalty to whatever piece of plastic it called home. There is a common misconception in modern gaming that fixed camera angles were a technical shackle, a compromise made because the hardware simply wasn't up to the task. But when you look at the Resident Evil Remake, it becomes immediately clear that this perspective was an artistic choice, a piece of visual alchemy that has never truly been surpassed. By sticking with pre-rendered backgrounds, Capcom was able to pour every ounce of the GameCube's processing power into lighting, shadows and character models. The result was a game that looked better in 2002 than many 3D titles did a decade later. It wasn't just good for its time, it was a hauntingly beautiful masterclass in art direction. The mansion felt alive in a way that fully 3D environments often struggle to replicate. You could see the dust motes dancing in the beams of the moonlight, the way the curtains swayed in a draft you could almost feel through the screen, and the terrifyingly realistic lightning strikes that would illuminate a hallway for a split second, revealing a silhouette that wasn't there a moment before. Every camera angle was a composed frame, designed by a director to maximise your unease. It forced you to hear what you couldn't see, the wet rhythmic slapping of a zombie's feet just around the corner that you were terrified to turn. This wasn't just a house, it was a claustrophobic, oppressive entity. Seeing these creatures we had known for years transformed into high-definition versions of themselves was mind-blowing. The textures on the zombies, rotten flesh, the glisten of a hunter's scales, and the sheer detail in Jill and Chris's uniforms made it feel like we'd finally stepped into a big-budget horror film. It's wild to think that this jump happened in just 6 years. It was the absolute peak of the diorama style of gaming, and honestly, a part of me wishes we had stayed there a bit longer. There is an intimacy and focus in this style that modern over-the-shoulder cameras often lose. It forces you to look at the world the way the developer wants you to, making every single room a deliberate crafted experience in dread.
Barry.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really? Thanks.
If Resident Evil Remake was a love letter to the fans, the Crimson Heads with the poison pen tucked inside the envelope. For years, we had been conditioned by the PS1 trilogy to follow a very simple loop. See a zombie, drop the zombie and move on. Once they were face down in a pool of their own blood, the threat was over. But in 2002, Capcom realised that our greatest weakness was our own confidence. They knew we'd walk into the Spencer Mansion thinking we were experts, and they used that muscle memory to absolutely ruin us. The introduction of the Crimson Head mechanic is, in my opinion, the single greatest evolution of a gameplay loop in survival horror history. It starts with a subtle realisation. You kill a zombie in a high traffic hallway, maybe the one leading to the save room, and you leave it there. You come back 10 minutes later, and the body's still there, but it looks different. It's flushed a deep, angry red. Suddenly it twitches. Before you can even process what's happening, it's up. It isn't shambling anymore. It's sprinting at you with talons out and a scream that sounds like tearing metal. The first time a Crimson Head gets up, it shatters your senses of safety. You realise that every victory you've had up to that point was actually just setting up a timer for your own demise. This changed the meta game of Resident Evil entirely. Now every kill was a tactical decision. Do I use my limited kerosene to burn this body? Do I have enough fuel in the canteen? Do I risk leaving it and hope I don't need to come back this way? It turned the very act of clearing a room into a source of long-term anxiety. You weren't just managing your inventory. You were managing a graveyard that was constantly trying to resurrect itself. It's the ultimate gotcha moment, and it's why the remake feels so much more oppressive than the original. It proved that Capcom wasn't just interested in making the game look better. They wanted to make sure that even 20 years later, we'd still be terrified of a body lying on a carpet. While the original 1996 game was essentially a B-movie run through a haunted house, the remake introduced a layer of tragic, philosophical dread that shifted the entire tone of the franchise. That shift is personified in Lisa Trevor. Before 2002, the monsters in Resident Evil were just biological accidents, science gone wrong, but with the addition of the Lisa Trevor subplot, Capcom added a soul to the horror, and it was a broken, agonising one. Lisa wasn't just another boss fight, she was a living testament to the cruelty of Umbrella, a girl who had been experimented on for decades until she was something unrecognisable, yet still tethered to the memory of her mother. The first time you encounter her in the woods, it's unlike anything else in the series. You hear her before you see her, the dragon of chains and a low, mournful moaning that sounds more like grief than aggression. When she emerges from the shadows of that dilapidated cabin, wearing the literal faces of her victims stitched onto her own, it's a level of macabre imagery that the PS1 hardware could never have conveyed. She is invincible, a relentless force that you can only survive, not defeat. This changed the pace of the game. Suddenly, the mansion wasn't just a puzzle box, it was a tomb where you were being hunted by a ghost of Umbrella's past. What makes Lisa Trevor so effective is how her story is told through the environment. Finding the discarded journals and the family picture file turns her from a monster into a victim. It recontextualises the entire Spencer mansion. You aren't just uncovering a lab, you're uncovering a crime scene that has been festering for 30 years. Her inclusion elevated the remake from a simple action horror game into a gothic tragedy. It proved that the most terrifying thing in the world wasn't a virus or a giant spider, it was the cold, calculated inhumanity of the people who built the house in the first place. For me, Lisa is the reason the game feels so much heavier than the original. She stays with you long after the credits roll, a reminder that some nightmares don't end when you pull the trigger. In the 1996 original, the Spencer Mansion felt like a series of interconnected rooms, a playground for a survival horror game, but in the 2002 remake, the mansion was rebuilt into a living, breathing entity. Capcom didn't just up the resolution, they expanded the geography of the nightmare. By adding the graveyard, the forest path and the terrifyingly isolated cabin, they broke the safety of the mansion walls. You were no longer just trapped in a house. You were trapped in an estate where every inch of the architecture was designed to funnel you towards your own demise. It's a masterclass in level design that makes the house feel like the true antagonist of the game. The genius of the remake's layout is how it subverts the expectations of anyone who has played the PS1 version. You walk into a familiar hallway, expecting a door to lead where it always did, only to find it's been broken or blocked, forcing you into a new, darker wing of the house. The mansion is a puzzle box that requires you to learn its rhythms. You start to memorise the floorboards that creak, the windows that rattle when the wind hits it a certain way, and the shortcuts that might save your life or lead you straight into a crimson head you forgot to burn. It's a claustrophobic, oppressive atmosphere that never lets up even when you find a safe room. There's a soul to this architecture that modern horror often misses. Every room tells a story through its clutter. You see the half-eaten meals, the discarded notes of researchers who knew they were dying, and the subtle, gothic decay of a family legacy that has rotted from the inside out. The mansion feels old, heavy and cursed. When the lightning flashes and illuminates the grand dining hall or the winding marble staircases, it's not just a graphical flourish, it's the house showing its teeth. It's a place where the history is as dangerous as the monsters, and by the time you finally reach the underground labs, the mansion has become a character you've fought, respected, and eventually feared. It is the gold standard for environmental-driven storytelling, proving that a setting can be just as memorable as the person holding the controller. One of the most enduring debates in the Resident Evil community is which protagonist offers the definitive experience, and the remake leans into those differences with surgical precision. In 1996, the choice between Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield felt like a difficulty set and disguised as a character select. In 2002, that gap was widened into two completely different tonal journeys. Jill, the Master of Unlocking, remains the accessible entry point. With her 8 inventory slots and the multi-purpose grenade launcher, her campaign feels like a high-stakes action thriller. She has the tools to solve the problems, and Barry Burton, the ultimate safety net, is always there to bail her out of a tight spot. Chris, on the other hand, is the series' original hard mode. With only 6 inventory slots, you aren't just playing a survival horror game, you're playing a brutal exercise in logistics. Playing as Chris forces you to make agonising choices about what to leave behind. Do I take the extra herb or the small key needed to progress? Without Jill's lockpick, Chris is forced to hunt for old-fashioned keys, lengthening his journey and exposing him to more danger. He can take more physical punishment and his critical hit rate with the handgun is higher, but the mental tax of managing that tiny inventory makes his run feel far more desperate. Beyond the mechanics, the narrative perspective shifts significantly. Jill's story is tied to the mystery of the Star's traitors and her partnership with Barry, giving it a cinematic emotional weight. Chris's story is a more isolated affair, focused on his rescue mission of Rebecca Chambers. My bottom line has always been that Jill's campaign is the movie version, the one where the plot flows perfectly, while Chris's campaign is the survival version, designed for the player who wants to feel every bit of the mansion's crushing weight. What's brilliant about the remake is that it doesn't just copy and paste the scenarios. The way items are distributed and the way NPCs interact with you changes the rhythm of the game. It forces you to master the mansion twice. If you only play as Jill, you've seen the horror, but if you play as Chris, you've truly survived it. It's this duality that gives the game such incredible replay value, proving that the character you choose isn't just an avatar, it's the lens through which you experience the entire nightmare. In the original 1996 release, the soundtrack was iconic for its B-movie energy, pulsing Civ tracks, and the infamous director's cut DualShock version, that bizarre, trumpet-heavy basement theme that has since become a meme. But for the 2002 remake, Capcom threw the campiness out the window and replaced it with a somber, orchestral weight that defines the game's atmosphere. The audio design in this game is a masterclass in psychological warfare. It understands that in a horror game, what a player doesn't hear is often more terrifying than a swell and violin section. The remake isn't afraid to let you sit in total silence. You'll walk through a hallway where the only sound is the rhythmic clack 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 of Jill's boots on the marble floor or the distant muffled howl of the wind outside. This silence is a trap. It forces your brain to fill the void with imagined threats. You start hearing things. Was that the floorboard creaking behind you, or just the game's ambient house noises? When the music does kick in, it's often low, discordant and oppressive. It doesn't tell you to be scared, it reminds you that you are already in danger. Then there are the diegetic sounds, the noises that actually exist within the world, the groan of the mansion as it settles, the sudden sharp crack of thunder that makes you jump out of your skin, and the wet, guttural breathing of a zombie you haven't spotted yet. Capcom also fixed one of the original's most charming flaws, the voice acting. Gone are the days of the Master of Unlocking being delivered with a confused shrug. The 2002 script is played straight with a somber, professional tone that treats the tragedy of the Star's team with the respect it deserves. This tonal shift from campy horror to gothic tragedy is largely carried by the audio. It turns the Spencer Mansion from a video game level into a real suffocating place. By the time you reach the save room, that iconic soothing melody doesn't just feel like a gameplay mechanic, it feels like a literal deep breath after being underwater for an hour. The Nintendo GameCube is often remembered as a family-friendly purple lunchbox, but for a brief window in 2002, it was the most hardcore horror destination on the planet. The Resident Evil Remake was the flagship of the Capcom 5, a bold pack that was supposed to define the GameCube's identity. When you saw the tiny optical disc spinning inside the console, It felt like you were witnessing a miracle. This was Nintendo's attempt to age up with its audience, providing a home for the kind of dark, mature experiences that the Nintendo 64 had mostly lacked. For me, this game was the sole reason the GameCube entered my house. I didn't really care about the new 3D Mario games or Zelda at that time. I was already invested in Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation. I'd kinda moved on, so when I got the GameCube, I just wanted to see the lightning hit those pre-rendered floorboards. However, the history of this game is bittersweet because it effectively changed the trajectory for the entire genre. Despite the universal critical acclaim with critics calling it the pinnacle of the series, the initial sales were underwhelming. It didn't set the world on fire like Resident Evil 2 did on the PlayStation because it was locked to a console with a smaller install base. Many fans simply missed out. This commercial failure, in Capcom's eyes at the time, had a massive ripple effect. Shinji Mikami famously looked at the sales figures and concluded that the players were getting tired of the tank controls and the slow, methodical pace of classic survival horror. This realisation is exactly what led to the radical transformation of Resident Evil 4. If the remake had sold 10 million copies, we might still be playing fixed camera horror games today. It's a strange irony. The game that perfected the formula was also the game that killed it for over a decade. But looking back, that exclusivity gave the GameCube a specific kind of soul. It made the console feel like a sanctuary for the purists, the people who appreciated the craft of a fixed angle masterpiece. It remains the most sophisticated game in the GameCube's library, a reminder of a time when Capcom was willing to risk everything on atmosphere and artistic integrity over mass market action.
The show must go on. It's not like we're out of this yet.
I think you'd better take a look at
What
this.
is it?
No.
Chris!
For over a decade, the Resident Evil Remake was a legendary ghost, trapped on a Nintendo console that many people had long since tucked away in their attics. It wasn't until the 2015 HD Remaster that the world finally got to see what the GameCube kids had been shouting about for years. Bringing a game built on pre-rendered backgrounds into the widescreen, high-definition era was a massive technical challenge, but the result was a revelation. It proved that true art direction is timeless. Even with the textures sharpened and the resolution bumped up, the mansion didn't lose an ounce of its oppressive atmosphere. The HD release brought with it a controversial addition, the modern control scheme. For the first time, you could move Jill or Chris in the direction you push the analog stick, bypassing the classic tank controls. On one hand, this made the game infinitely more accessible to a new generation of players who found the forward is always forward logic frustrating. On the other hand, it slightly broke the game's intentional tension. The fixed camera angles were designed around the limitations of tank controls. Being able to instantly pivot and sprint away from a zombie changed the math of the encounters. It made the protagonists feel a bit too agile for the claustrophobic hallways they were trapped in. Yet, despite the control debate, the remaster was a resounding success. It broke sales records on digital platforms, proving to Capcom that there was still a massive, hungry audience for old-school survival horror. It was the success of this remaster that paved the way for the Resident Evil 2 remake and the modern renaissance of the series. It gave the game a second life, allowing it to be played on everything from PC to handhelds. Seeing the Spencer Mansion in 1080p and later 4K was a reminder that Capcom had achieved something nearly impossible in 2002. They had created a visual style so robust that it didn't need a total overhaul to stay relevant. It just needed a bit of polish to let the original brilliance shine through. It's the rare case of a remaster of a remake that feels completely justified.
Jill,
Barry,
I could have at least waited up for you, you know?
let's go.
With the runaway success of modern RE engine overhauls, the question inevitably comes up, when is it time to give the Spencer Mansion the Resident Evil 2 remake treatment? We've seen what Capcom can do with over-the-shoulder cameras and photorealistic gore, and there's a vocal part of the fanbase that wants to see Jill and Chris in that style. But for me, a remake of the remake is entirely unnecessary. The 2002 version is already the perfected form of that story. To change the perspective to an over-the-shoulder camera would be to strip away the very thing that makes the original Mansion work. The curated cinematic dread of the fixed camera. You can't improve on a masterpiece that has already achieved its vision. You can only change it into something else. However, I'm not against a new way to experience this era. If Capcom really feels the need to return to the Arklay Mountains, I don't think they should just retread the same ground. Instead, imagine a massive, unified epic that merges Resident Evil 0 and the remake into one seamless experience. Rather than seeing the Mansion through the lens of Jill or Chris for the 100th time, why not shift the entire perspective to Rebecca Chambers? She is the link between the two games. We could start with the Ecliptic Express and follow her harrowing journey through the Umbrella training facility, leading directly into her arrival at the Mansion and her desperate survival until the STARS team arrives. This would allow Capcom to use the RE engine to build a new perfected version of the event without replacing the 2002 classic. It would give Rebecca Chambers the spotlight she deserves and provide a fresh perspective on a story we know by heart. We could see the Mansion through the eyes of someone who wasn't a super cop yet, someone who was just a rookie medic watching their team get torn apart. The bottom line is that the 2002 remake is untouchable in its current form. It doesn't need to be replaced, it needs to be supplemented. By merging the two stories, Capcom could give us a reason to go back into the woods without treading on the toes of the greatest survival horror game ever made. As I sit here in 2026, looking back at a journey that started 30 years ago, it's hard not to feel a bit sentimental. We've come a long way from that 6-year-old boy sat on the patterned carpet, terrified by a handful of pixels. The Resident Evil Remake stands as the definitive bridge between that childhood fear and that adult appreciation for game design. It's the rare case where a piece of media actually lives up to the impossible standards of nostalgia. It took everything that made the 1996 original classic, the isolation, the puzzles, the Jill sandwich charm, and it refined it into a sombre, gothic masterpiece that has yet to be unseated as the king of survival horror. This game is the reason I still believe in the power of the fixed camera and the slow burn. It's a reminder that horror isn't just about what jumps at you, it's about the atmosphere that settles over you like a heavy, damp shroud. With the PSX index moving forward, documenting the 1,278 games that define the grey box era, the remake acts as an expansion pack to our history. It's the proof that even when a console generation ends, the spirit of its best ideas can be perfected on the new hardware. We've officially closed the book on the Spencer Mansion incident for now, having given the greatest remake of all time the respect it deserves. But the remake in the Arklay Mountains didn't start with Jill and Chris. To truly understand how the Mansion became a tomb, we have to go back 24 hours before the STARS Alpha team even landed. Next time, we're staying on the GameCube and heading into the heart of the forest to look at Resident Evil 0. It's a game that took the remake engine and tried to flip the script with partner swapping mechanics and a story that finally put Rebecca Chambers in the lead. It's beautiful, it's frustrating, and it's the final piece of the classic puzzle before the series changed forever. The train is leaving the station, and the horror is only just beginning.
23 people.
Who's controlling the train?
She's just a rookie, a member of STARS.
Resident Evil 0.
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.